Voter ID laws have become somewhat controversial over the last couple of decades because for a while states didn't have very many of them or didn't enforce them as strictly, but nowadays many states have enacted newer voter ID laws, many which require photo identification, many of which are strictly enforced.
These laws are controversial because on the one hand, proponents claim that they're needed in order to prevent fraud. On the other hand, opponents argue that they will keep some people from voting since a substantial portion of the population doesn't have ID and will have an especially negative effect on participation by racial minorities and people who are poor.
Now, there's been a lot of litigation about voter identification laws and whether or not they're discriminatory. And for the most part, the courts have been mixed. They look at the particular jurisdiction, they look at the kinds of identification that are available to voters, they look at whether or not it's a strict or non-strict regime, whether it's a photo or non-photo regime, and depending on the evidence, what political science there is or what the recent electoral history is, courts have come out on both sides of the question. In some circumstances saying that the voter identification laws aren't discriminatory, and other places say they place too great a burden on certain populations of the public or maybe the voter public as a whole.
It's generally the more severe or strict voter identification laws that get challenged in courts. Those are laws likely to exclude more people, obviously. The stricter the identification requirement, the more likely it is that some people won't have it and therefore will be burdened or disabled from voting.
On the one hand, we want to have secure elections. We want to prevent voter fraud. At the same time, we recognize that they can be barriers to access for those who lack an appropriate form of identification and might be turned away from the polls on election day. On the whole, these voter identification laws do little to burden voters, and therefore, it's a reason why the Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision in Crawford, concluded that these laws do pass constitutional muster.
Even if they don't explicitly prevent certain groups of people from voting, like poor people or racial minorities or felons, if a law imposes a significant burden on voting, the state should have to come up with a strong justification for such a law.
States have an interest in ensuring that elections are conducted with integrity. They want to prevent voter fraud, and they want to make sure that the public feels confident that when they cast a vote, their vote is meaningful and it's going to be effectively cast and counted at the end of the day.
The incidence of voter impersonation fraud, the only kind of fraud that a voter ID law is really going to prevent, is vanishingly small. If you look at where voter fraud actually occurs in real life, now it's not common in any form, but it most commonly occurs with absentee ballots. A voter identification law, which requires people to present photo ID or something like it when they go to the polls, it's not going to do anything about people submitting absentee ballots on behalf of other people who aren't really actual people or who didn't really vote their absentee ballots the way they've been marked.
Voter identification addresses a fairly narrow and what I think is uncommon form of voter fraud, which is in-person voting fraud. Somebody who shows up at the polling place saying, "I'm John Smith," when they're not John Smith and trying to cast a vote on their behalf. There are greater problems when it comes to addressing voter fraud. One is poll worker fraud. Poll workers who fraudulently cast ballots after the polls are closed, or who destroy or alter ballots in the counting process before they're delivered.
The best argument that I've heard is the so-called broken windows argument, that yeah, even if voter ID isn't really going to do much to prevent fraud, having a voter identification law and tightening things up around the polling place will prevent sloppiness and some of the shady practices that might go along with it.
The best argument in favor of a voter identification law is that it's a common sense and simple way of preventing voter fraud. It might not protect all kinds of voter fraud. It might require a little bit of a burden from voters to make sure that they have the right forms of identification, but so far it seems to have negligible, if any, impact on elections.
I think the best argument against the strictest voter ID laws is that we don't need them and they're going to keep at least some people from voting. We have this idea that I think people across the ideological spectrum in the United States of America believe that every eligible citizen should be able to cast their vote, that the right to vote is really important to our democracy.
We want the appearance of fairness, And that's an important aspect of the voter identification law, that it shows that everybody is required to show it. Everybody has a very tangible reminder when they show up to the polling place that there is an accountability procedure that's occurring, and it helps ensure the integrity of the election process.